I now draw the attention of the board to agenda item 15A, report of independent evaluation of the Readiness Preparatory Support Program, including the Secretariat Management Response. The board has before it document GCF/B22/03, entitled Independent Evaluation of the Green Climate Fund Readiness Preparatory Support Program, RPSP, final report, and its addendum containing the management response from Secretariat. I would like to invite Joe to briefly introduce from Independent Evaluation Unit to briefly introduce the item. Joe, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Co-Chair. Could I have my slides on, please? Thank you. So my presentation is titled Independent Evaluation of the Readiness Program, Making GCF Faster, Better, Smarter. And this is an effort to underscore one of the values of evaluations, Chair, which is that we can use evaluations to strengthen organizations and not merely view them as accountability exercises. So the overall objective of the evaluation, just as a recap, was essentially given through a mandate to us by the board last year, where it requested the IU to undertake the evaluation of the Readiness Program, also called the RPSP, to look at the effectiveness of the Readiness Program, and this is a very brief recap, recommend gains in effectiveness, efficiency, country ownership, and sustained impact. Before I go into the findings, I want to thank the Secretariat for being very collegial and supporting this evaluation and providing us with timely data. I also want to underscore that the data that we are using, if you remember, this was supposed to come to the board at B21, so October of 2018. And so the data that we are using is till the middle of July 2018, so a couple of months before we were bringing it to the board. And I'm going to jump quickly into evaluation findings, Chair. And I'm going to present evaluation findings on 4 key topics, and I've divided them for ease into what's working and what's not working. Yeah? So the first is on relevance. On relevance, what has worked for the Readiness Program when we compared the Readiness Program of the GCF to other global funds that have readiness programs? We found that in its design and its vision, it definitely reflected greater ambition. We also found that if we compared it with other readiness programs, so those that are there, for example, in the Multilateral Fund, in the Adaptation Fund, in the Climate Investment Funds, etc., the design and the mandate is relevant to the country's climate needs, and in at least 3 aspects, the Readiness Fund of the GCF, in its vision at least, was far superior to the readiness activities of other funds. And this is mainly with respect to its focus on strengthening NDAs, on focusing on stakeholder consultations in country, as well as in focusing on developing strategic frameworks in country. So this is in its design. What has not worked so well is that we find that although at least till 2018, in its early version, it was focusing on NDAs, strengthening and developing strategic frameworks. We found that if you compare the Readiness Fund of the GCF and then also looked at a whole lot of actors in the field, currently the niche of the GCF Readiness Program is ill-defined. A few other factors might help to inform this a little bit more. We found that 1/4 of the countries that were eligible for readiness funds were not accessing readiness. And this by itself may not, throw up red flags, except the one thing we'd like to note is that some of these countries are low-capacity countries, where there is immense potential for readiness to do a lot more for meeting country needs and to developing their own capacity for climate finance. We also found that 40% of those accessing readiness did not have funded projects. And we understand that this is still quite early in the overall evolution of the GCF, but it's also important that one of the objectives as outlined in the governing instrument of the Readiness Program, is working with countries so that they can enhance their capacities for accessing GCF funding. And if one of the indicators of that is funded projects, then it wasn't meeting its target, essentially. We find that operationally, one size fits all. And again, we did note in our report, and I'm hoping that many of you have read it. It's a very nice-looking report, and we are very proud of it. But we find that operationally, there is a one-size-fits-all paradigm that is espoused by the program, and that doesn't meet the differentiated needs of countries. And I'm going to talk about this briefly again. But overall, there's a need to build capacity in countries for quality proposals that are strongly linked with climate mitigation and adaptation, that readiness could meet in a far more strong way. I'm going to move now to country ownership. On country ownership, what is working is that when we looked at the data and we examined the entire portfolio of readiness proposals that had been approved, we found that 70% of the proposals that had been approved were working towards strengthening NDAs in countries. And this was basically very much coherent with one of the objectives of what readiness was trying to do. We also found that readiness was helping countries, at least appropriately, to work on in-country consultation processes, which was good. In country ownership, what we find has not worked is that currently readiness is still disproportionately resource and time intensive. And let me explain that a little bit. The perception amongst countries is that readiness is essentially $1 million for a year, and then they have to come back to GCF to get, their allocation for next year. Essentially, the perception again is, and part of this has been clarified and will be clarified, I believe, by the Secretariat, is that those funds last only for a year. However, currently, the Secretariat takes about 6 to 7 months to essentially process these proposals, which is a significant part of a year. And so what we're also suggesting in our recommendations is that there be a longer timeline if this is still going to be true. However, we are also encouraging the Secretariat to think about the resource and time intensity of the process as readiness goes forward. One of the other areas that we are recommending is that readiness finance and capacity building support currently is insufficient for pipeline development, where pipeline development, and this I think is also underscored by the previous figure that I presented to you. To continue, we also found that although readiness was helping to strengthen NDAs, priority countries for the GCF, so Africa, SIDS, and LDCs, were showing the least effect on strengthening NDAs through readiness. And this is important, especially because readiness does have a niche there in our thinking. Currently, country programs, which is a big focus for the Secretariat, are relatively vague, and their rationale, and I take the point made earlier, but their climate rationale in terms of mitigation and adaptation is either vague or absent, and that needs to be strengthened far more. We also found that although in-country consultation processes were quite strong, as espoused by the readiness actors on ground and in-country, participation of civil society was still rudimentary. I'm going to move now to effectiveness. In effectiveness, what has not worked so well is that currently, although readiness has been very good in nominating and identifying actors for accreditation, it has not been effective in moving direct access entities, potential direct access entities, through basic or upgraded accreditation. Where we do see some successes, and this speaks also to the niche of the readiness program, we find that there are a whole lot of other actors that are helping to galvanize this sort of accreditation, and which is why one of our recommendations is also for the readiness program to define its niche. I mean, it's absolutely fine for readiness to work in a very in a crowded landscape, but having a comparative advantage is important. Given the amount of time that it usually takes to get readiness proposals approved, we find as well that majority countries don't push for direct access and favor international entities, which then discounts the business model that the GCF ultimately has. And so we're also recommending to the Secretariat that far more focus and be made on this, as well as the process be strengthened far more. In terms of the private sector, currently, although well-intentioned, the readiness program has little or no impact on crowding in the private sector. And part of this has to do, and we did very elaborate work on understanding what the causal chains were in identifying potential bottlenecks. But a lot of this has to do with capacity of staff on the ground, the capacity of the countries, the NDAs themselves, as well as within GCF. And it's really important to think about this as we go forward, and if we do want to use readiness to focus on private sector, galvanizing the private sector. The last criteria that I'm going to quickly present on is efficiency. So what the team did, and I do want to also use this occasion to note that the team that worked on it was led by Solomon Asfour, who's sitting right next to me, and also by Joseph, who's sitting behind me as well. We basically found that the Secretariat has done tremendously well in this aspect. In 2015, it used to take a median number of 420 days to get a proposal from submission to first disbursement. Now, it takes about 170 days, and this is a median number. So this is essentially typical in 50% of the portfolio. So that's a good number, but yes, it does mask a lot of regional differences, and we have remarked on those in our report as well. In terms of what has not worked so well, there are still standard operating procedures that need to be specified and articulated clearly. And we've also noted that although the overall median time has reduced, the length of legal procedures in the overall cycle has, the number of days there has increased. And so we've underscored that as well. We understand that the GCF does not have regional presence, and the Secretariat works through regional advisors, and that's been an innovative way. But currently, that's been an innovative way to deal with this. But currently, regional advisors are currently not empowered to support in-country work in the best possible way. And this has also occurred to a large extent because the readiness program has changed very quickly. And we have, in the report, actually commended the readiness program and how quickly it has learned. But because those changes require communication with the field teams, that has left a lot of the advisors in the field sort of grasping for straws. So, in terms of overall recommendations, Co-Chair, we're recommending an overall rethink of the readiness strategy. When we started to think about this evaluation, we came to it with three basic questions. And we ended our report with those three basic questions, which we think that the readiness program really does need to answer in its new strategy, should it rethink it. First, it needs to think about what is it getting countries ready for? So ready for what? Is it global finance or GCF finance? Neither one of those questions are, neither one of those answers are wrong answers, but it needs to identify what the answer is. So ready for what? It also needs to say, when are countries ready? How will GCF know that countries are ready? And then, how ready are countries? And this essentially speaks to developing and articulating clearly a vision, targets, and measurement and management protocols. Our first and second set of recommendations then essentially also talk about greater focus on capacity building, outreach, and support. And I'm happy to talk about these at length, should you require. Strengthening country programs, especially given that countries are unclear about their focus as of now and what they help them to deliver. And we're also recommending secretariat-level changes. So in secretariat-level changes, we're recommending flexibility in the post-approval process. So after countries are able to get approval on their proposals, that there be some flexibility for countries to see, essentially change course given their changed circumstances and context. We're also requesting the Secretariat to think about clarifying the roles and responsibilities of not just staff, but also all of the folks who are involved essentially in delivering readiness, that is in country as well as at the Secretariat. So the NDAs, the delivery partners, the direct access entities, and civil society as well. And then we're also asking the Secretariat to think about developing standard operating procedures, turnaround times, and having open databases so that countries are able to see as to where their proposals are as they go forward. The last set of recommendations, Co-Chair, are essentially saying that business as usual cannot continue with this after what we basically found on the field. And should the Secretariat be open to it and should the board like to consider it, we also do discuss some options for the board to consider where the Secretariat could customize the readiness program to country needs and provide for differentiated needs while being ready for scale. And this is really important. We do think that the Secretariat needs to build for scale, but at the same time, essentially evolve a mechanism which is able to provide for differentiated needs amongst countries. There is a draft decision in front of you, Chair, which essentially the key points of which are the board takes note of the findings and recommendations of the IAU's report, takes note also of the Secretariat's management response, and requests the Secretariat to incorporate recommendations, as well as report on the implementation of these recommendations. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you. I'd like to ask now Osman to present also on the Secretariat, on the management response.
Thank you, Co-Chair. The IAU conducted a thorough evaluation with a number of specific findings and recommendations. We use these inputs as we design the reverse readiness strategy, and I will discuss that in more detail later on. We noted that the findings were largely consistent with the findings of the Secretariat's own review of the readiness program in 2017. That was presented in B19. Therefore, as you can see, we found agreement or partial agreement with 95% of the IAU's findings. The Secretariat has already begun to address some of these findings through the readiness program operations. The specific items displayed on the screen require further elaboration on disagreement between the IAU findings and the management response. The rapid acceleration of implementation of the readiness program ever since the IAU concluded its evaluation in 2018 is evident in the first finding. As it is today, approved readiness grants now benefit full 84% of eligible countries, with only 16% of countries yet to access the resources. Enabling direct access is a paramount goal of the readiness program, and we note the low utilization by the countries of the readiness resources for pipeline development activities in the first phase of the program. Furthermore, The support for accreditation of direct access entities, coupled with a renewed focus of pipeline development, will help push that number in a higher second phase of the program. As it stands now, 19 of the 41 direct access entities accredited are headquartered in SEEDS, LDCs, and Africa. We would continue to work with these entities to avail them readiness resources for pipeline development in the second phase. Finally, as of today, 65% of readiness resources are committed to priority countries. Foundational readiness support, including for strong NDA and direct access accreditation support, will remain a fixture of the readiness program, even as some countries move towards more targeted and highly technical assistance. Of the approved national adaptation plans, 64% are in SEEDS, LDCs, and African states. As you will notice in the next agenda item on the proposed revised readiness program, the Secretariat envisions a fit-for-purpose readiness program that is outcome-focused while retaining flexibility for countries to seek support based on their actual needs. We believe this new orientation addresses the key recommendations highlighted by the IU's evaluation. We take this opportunity to thank Jo and her team for a very useful evaluation and look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Jo, for the presentation. I would like to draw your attention to there is a draft decision in the annex. But before that, I would like to also open the floor if there are any comments. And I see Paul, your flag is up. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I draw three conclusions from the prior two presentations, which I appreciate very much from the two expositors. One, the program suffers from mission overreach. There are too many objectives. It's trying to do too many things at the same time. Two, it needs to be more focused around the GCF. And that is a way to reduce the mission creep overreach that comes from having so many objectives, some of which are further and further out from the GCF program. And three, that the program suffers from design flaws in the GCF model that need to be corrected. To wit, the separation of preparedness from accreditation, from program formulation, rather. To briefly go over these points, point one, the plethora of objectives, NDAs, NDCs, NAPs, stakeholder consultation, accreditation, direct access entities, country program, and project formulation. Yet, the evaluation finds that it needs to be strengthened in capacity building, which, in my view, should be its core mission. As a preparedness program, the core mission should be the capacity building, so there could be more focus with less objectives, more direct relation to the GCF, and emphasis on capacity building. Two, it needs to be more GCF focus. That's the way to reduce the number of objectives. All of these objectives are laudable, but the GCF preparedness program does not need to be the preparedness program of the Paris Agreement and of the Convention on Climate Change. It's a part of it, but it doesn't have to have the reach out to all of these different aspects. And it needs to definitely strengthen capacity building, zeroing in with more focus on the GCF. When we say that it suffers from design flaws in the GCF model that need to be corrected, we have the preparedness program, at the end of which 40% of the countries, or at the midterm mark, don't present projects to the GCF. I don't think that's acceptable. I think if it has more GCF focus, it should be producing pipeline for the GCF. Yet we learned from the evaluation that there's insufficient, that the resources are insufficient for the pipeline development of the GCF, which should be one of its core outputs derived from the capacity building. So I think that, you know, $1 million is not a small amount of money in technical assistance. And you have 1 year of that, 2 years of that, $2 million, and not have any relationship with the GCF afterwards? I don't think that's acceptable. And I think that denotes and underscores the lack of GCF focus. With regard to the design flaw, this idea of separating the preparedness from the accreditation and from the formulation of projects, I think, is a major design flaw in our model that should be corrected. Quite fortunately, there is a proposal before the board, as I understand it in this meeting, to combine accreditation with a project. I'm speaking from experience of decision-making at the ministerial level. Many ministers or director generals do not understand going through all those hoops of accreditation, and there's nothing at the end of the day. There's no money, there's no project, and you went through all of this, and you spent this money, and you devoted these resources, and there's no project. They will understand this much better if the accreditation is with project formulation. And then you can focus in on the preparedness for the accreditation and the project formulation, which increases then the relevance for the GCF. I think that this is extremely important. It was mentioned by the evaluator that countries prefer to go to the international accredited entities and not through direct access. It's a no-brainer. You go to FAO, you go to UNDP, you go to UNEP, and you're there, they work with you, and a project comes out, and it goes to the GCF. You're working on preparedness, and then to get into the accreditation, and there's still no project. There's no comparison. Of course you're going to go to FAO and ask them to help you, and they're more than willing, because not only this program is doing preparedness. UNDP is doing preparedness, FAO is doing preparedness, UN Environment, which is PNUMA's new label, is doing this, and they're all wanting to develop their project lines, their programs, by preparing our people, and then they take the project to the GCF, and if it's a large project, they get their 3%, and so on and so forth. But they, you know, they get their people working, and their programs widen. So I think that if this could cut down on the objectives, focus more on the GCF, and if we could approve this accreditation with project, that would help very much in overcoming the asymmetry between what it takes to do direct access and to do the international accredited entities. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Paul, for these remarks and suggestion. Well, I have a list of 8 requests for the floor. We were hoping to complete the 2 items on the Readiness Preparatory Support Program, item 15A and B. We are now doing 15A. And we have about 35 minutes. So we'll try to do our best, and I am sure that you will help us. Ayman?
Well, we'll make it very short. Thank you very much for the 2 presentations and for the effort was done. I think what we're missing here is the context, really, of where we stand, why we are, in this situation. I think you need to understand the nature of the Secretariat, the issues that the Secretariat suffered from. In 2.5 years, we lost 4 heads of departments. We lost 2 executive directors, and there is a great deal of sort of improvement in the staffing. We had high attrition earlier in the year, so this needs to be taken into account. It's not really the system, it's the circumstances, the environment, and we really, I think, need to be mindful of that despite all the suffering that we had, we managed to do something. We managed to achieve some great results here. I just want to make sure that we're really evaluating, not auditing. Make sure that we're really in the mode of trying to improve, not try to pin down the issues and try to, find faults. And this is exactly what you said, Joe. For Pa, in your presentation, thank you very much. But I see we have categorization that I'm not really familiar with to say eligible countries. I think all developing countries are eligible for readiness program. So we really need to stay away from saying eligible countries. And you're saying priority countries versus non-priority countries. I'm not sure what does that mean. Well, I know it says LDC is an African country, so let's just really keep the same terminologies because this may develop down the road to something else. So we really want to make sure that the terms are in line with the jargon that we normally use. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayman. I have Paola.
Thank you, Chair. And let me say that we appreciated this excellent evaluation by the Independent Evaluation Unit, and thank you, Joe, for a very clear and concise presentation with what worked, what didn't, and how to go about that. As you said, this goes to show the value of the independent evaluation exercise, which is a way for us to learn and to strengthen the institution. So thank you for that. And we should do that. And in this regard, let me say at the outset that we support the recommendations and we would like to see them implemented. The readiness program is very important also in light of what we said earlier in the previous sessions. And making countries GCF ready is an important task that we must fulfill. But we agree on the need to rethink this instrument, and we agree on the need to focus on the vision, on the targets, on the measures and the management. And as Paul said, we should focus and not spread ourselves too thin in trying to do that. I said that we support the recommendations. Let me focus especially on capacity building and outreach and support, which we believe are very important. We learned from the evaluation that the program has not worked well to strengthen country ownership. One of the aspects concerns in-country consultations and coordination. We think that focus on that, as well as on capacity building, is key. And in both respects, I would mention inclusiveness as an important element for success. And references made to the model of the Global Fund, I think we should follow up on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. Next, I have Chris. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Like Paola, we thought it was a really excellent evaluation and example of the type of learning that evaluations can bring to the organisation on a very important issue. I think from our perspective, many of the points were made by Paul about both the opportunity to think about ready for what and the opportunity to think about maximising the impact of this particularly important component of the GCF model. I think there needs to be far more focus on direct access in the readiness program. We saw the figures earlier today about the direct access being lower than any of us would want. And from our perspective, the readiness program can be a key tool in ensuring countries are ready for direct access, and making that a key focus of the fund makes sense. And like Paul, I think we feel that where an international entity is accessing this fund, it should clearly be linked to a specific proposal. So we think there is scope to strengthen the effectiveness and the focus of this very important part of the GCF model. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Sila. Sheikh Sila.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation, and Joe. And I think that, if you go to this recommendation, I will not address properly the issue, because the problem of the climate is a mess itself, because many intervene in the country, and you see you have one focal point UNFC, one focal point Adaptation Fund, one focal point GCF, and they are not coordinating. The civil society is not involved, or NGO, and addition to that, you have all multilateral agencies coming with their. You don't have country program as a beginning to be put in place, and from this country program to push project. The GCF now is will become like the old GCF, because when you go to the first thinking of direct access, is going very fast, country ownership, and having project very quick. But now we have a queue, and it's like the old GCF cycle, where you have 22 months, and for the country we will not see the result. It's why maybe we need to reorganize the system and to go like in the Montreal Protocol. Montreal Protocol, you have one focal point for everything, for all the ozone issue. And in the country, you have all the stakeholders together with the focal points. And when the country program is set up, you go project by project and you deliver. I don't want to be too long. Maybe we can have opportunity to talk about detail in the country, because we need to know what is going on in the ground. For the regional advisor also, you will face the same problem. I will come back later on, maybe in bilateral view, to make additional comments.
Thank you, Sheila. You definitely are welcome to talk to Secretary on that. Jeremiah?
Very quick, Chair, thank you. Let me commend the Secretary, especially the Department of Programming, and Joe and Steen for this great work. I think after a few years of implementing a readiness, and the assessment that comes out at this point is timely and appropriate. Let me commend the co-chairs also for moving this item forward. Previous board meeting, we've been trying to get to this. It never saw daylight, and always defer, but so let me commend you for this. Again, the reports are welcoming. As a country, as a group of country LDCs, many of whom have benefited from these readiness activities, particularly some of us being involved with the implementation. We definitely can associate and relate to your findings and think they are very pragmatic, they are real, and we welcome your recommendation. I think the board should give keen consideration in terms of moving forward to improving. Let me finally say that highlight or standing out of these really capacity building, because you see that not only countries successfully get approved for new readiness, the ability for this country to be able to implement within a specific period of time to absorb the resources they get become a challenge. So capacity at the NDA level really has all become a challenge. So if the readiness can be focused in terms of the type of expense category or allowable activities on a Readiness 2.0, you need to take a look at that. That will focus on what kind of capacity you can give the NDA in terms of increasing its absorptive capacity to be able to undertake drafting of a good control program, coordinating nationally, and even developing funding proposal. In fact, even helping national institutions begin the process of accreditation. So capacity is going to be very good. The second point that is really coming out is that the regional advisor, it can be overemphasized. You need people to work along with them. And then I want to close on the point that Paul really made. Paul has articulated clearly. I think the readiness need to focus on preparing countries for interaction with the Green Climate Fund and not overall Because if you take the adaptation fund, it has its own readiness approach. And so I think with these developed countries, African and ACID, and countries that really benefit from readiness will utilize this. Let me indicate the time it takes again. At the secretarial level, Ayman already said it. The time it takes for this fund which met to trickle down or get dispersed immediately, it takes so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. I have now Frank.
Thank you, Nakmaldeen. And my thanks also go to Joe and her team and to the Secretariat for the presentations and the useful information they generated for us on this very important program. We attach high importance to the Readiness program. I have a lot of comments here in my speaking notes, so you will bear with me a little bit. But I will then focus on what is concern I think we still need to discuss. I would agree with Paul that we really need to be clear on what is it we want to achieve through the Readiness program and not overburden the program. And I'm not sure whether we really achieved that. We need to be country specific and avoid being creating standardized packages. We need to avoid to overburden countries with requests for designing new strategies or things like that, and look on what we want to achieve through the Readiness program. I would like to relate this evaluation with the programming strategies discussion we had earlier on this afternoon. And I think there's still room to improvement in the orientation for the Readiness program in informing what country programming should be doing and helping countries to identify what they want from the GCF and how to translate this in funding proposals. And I have some difficulties to grasp this objective from the review of the program and the way the program is handled. My question to the Secretariat goes very specifically. If we approve the budget proposed, 122 million, what is the GCF buying for that? What will be the specific outcomes we are going to achieve? And I've seen some elements of that, but I don't grasp it. How many funding proposals, how many accredited entities we are expecting, what is the strengthened role of the NDA in exercising country ownership look like through the Readiness program. And I have some difficulties with the way the decision is crafted now as how the review and evaluation will be translated in a new approach, and what then will be the expected outcome of the Readiness program. We are going to be able to show that the Readiness program delivered tangible results for countries for implementation of funding proposals, which at the end of the day is what we want to see. So I appreciate some more clarifications in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Frank, if I may ask, you're referring to the decision on the evaluation and the management response, or the decision and the 15B where the money is requested there? Okay, that will take next. Now we're just addressing the, no problem. These are the two babies of the same program. Irina.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I wanted to thank Joe and Pa for the presentations. I have a couple of observations and a couple of suggestions. So first of all, let's not forget that readiness is an important portfolio of GCF, and I would call for a comprehensive approach. So my first observation is that the presentation was informative, the second presentation was argumentative, and with that being said, the first presentation felt more like gap analysis, because there was lack of reflection on the positive aspects of readiness. So my suggestion would be if we could further underline those and then build on the strengths of readiness. Whereas with the, as I dubbed it, the gap analysis, the weak spots, if those could be laid out in a more clearer fashion, so that we can have evidence-based decisions on how to improve. So basically, how do we eliminate our weaknesses and strengthen our positive sides and strengths? Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. We have still 3 flags and 15 minutes, and I really hope to conclude this, at least this item, before it's 6 o'clock. Next is Kate. Kate, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I will be brief. I just first of all wanted to particularly note and say thank you to the IEU and the Secretariat team, because I think this piece of work has been a really excellent example of constructive collaboration between those two teams on this joint piece of work. So it's been a really good model, and I hope that kind of working continues. So thank you very much. I'm not going to comment on the substance, because we're coming to that on the next agenda item, I think. But I just wanted to note that I think the conversation that we're starting to have here and the discussion that we'll have next is only possible because of the points raised in this evaluation that actually give us the evidence and the understanding to assess what's going on and to understand the strengths and the weaknesses, and then to think about what we do next. So it really enables us to learn and to improve. And I think, you know, there are important points we're already talking about how we make sure that the readiness funding is translating into GCF impact. So on that basis, I look forward to the next discussion, but I'm very happy to support the decision, and thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
I'm sorry to take the floor again, but there's another aspect of this, and that's looking at it from the ground up. And this has to do with the sociology of this, or the organizational dynamics of this, if you will. $2 million in 2 years are more resources for capacity building than any ministry in my government. Entire ministries. No one has $2 million for 2 years. And I would suspect that that's the case in many of our countries. And I think that when we see the data that 70% of the NDAs are involved, that's very good, because the NDAs are strengthening their capacity. And quite often these are the finance ministries, that's the way it is in my country, who are the richest guys on the block anyway. And all of a sudden they have these $2 million in technical assistance for capacity building, and they almost become like Itamaraty. You know, they're running the show with a lot of different ministries with that kind of resources in a poor country. And so they build up their capacity. Now, I don't have any problem with them building up their capacity. I don't have any problem with them moving this through the rest of the state, as long as there's a payoff for GCF. If you spend the $2 million and you strengthen the finance ministry in the country and the NDA themselves, and they don't deliver for GCF, I have a problem with that. So I think that that's where we have to zero in on them getting accreditation, getting project formulation, and showing results for the funds they receive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Helen?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, board members. We welcome the result of the IEU evaluation of the GCF Readiness and Preparatory Support Program, and glad that it recognizes and mirrors some CSO observations and experiences on the ground. We cannot overemphasize now that country ownership is very important and is at the heart of the GCF. However, it should not be equated simply to ownership of the government or selected stakeholders. This should be informed by no less than a governing instrument of the GCF, and it should ensure national stakeholders, including but not limited to women, indigenous peoples, civil society, and other vulnerable sectors, not as a matter of choice, but as a bare minimum. We are very happy to note that the IEU recommendation has considered the country coordination mechanism set up by the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria as a good example for country coordination, and invites the Secretariat to explore this option in the Readiness version 2.0. So CSOs have been, since our initial engagements, raising this example of mechanism that the GCF can emulate to build strong in-country coordination mechanisms. We totally agree that in order for countries to be GCF ready, they need to strengthen their capacity to better understand and implement necessary policies such as the gender, indigenous peoples policy, and environmental and social policy. Thus, we welcome the proposal of the Secretariat to have a greater capacity building support to be provided for NDAs and focal points to better integrate these policies in their readiness programs. We want to emphasize, though, that CSOs, women, indigenous peoples, and other national stakeholders at the country level are of equal importance with NDAs and accredited entities in terms of capacity building, and we recommend that there should be clear and transparent mechanisms put in place to ensure their participation and engagement in these capacity building activities. We agree and we are worried about the evaluation results showing the participation of CSOs and other national stakeholders being rudimentary, inconsistent, and varying from country to country, and that the program is designed to privilege government authority over other stakeholders. Hence, we believe that the Secretariat should be bolder in providing encouragement, better elaborated guidance, and support NDAs and engaging with CSOs, women, indigenous peoples, and other stakeholders. We also agree with the recommendation of the evaluation and the Secretariat proposed program on the need for a more tailor-fit country guidelines that take the individual realities of countries into account when implementing readiness activities. But we believe that there should also be a minimum compliance measure for stakeholders' engagement to ensure capacity to fully assess quality and effectiveness of these consultations being done in the ground. We also see the value of NDA reporting qualitative, not just quantitative information about the engagement of CSOs and other national stakeholders, and the possibility of incentivizing countries who have robust stakeholder engagement at the national level. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I would like now to turn to the Secretariat. And please provide response only to the issues raised related to the evaluation, not the other issues, because tomorrow we'll have the discussion on B15 and 15B, and then we can address the other issues just related to the evaluation, because this is a decision before us. And I will also have another concluding remark regarding how we treat the already concern related to 15B over the night. Okay. Okay, Joe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and I want to thank Paul and Armand, Paola, Chris, Shikzila, Jeremiah, Frank, Irina, Kate, and Helen for your comments. Thank you very much. I'm going to, for the sake of brevity, actually try and respond to Ayman and Irina's comments, and hopefully get Pa to respond to the others. So thank you very much, Ayman and Irina, for pointing out that we were basically presenting, our key recommendations. And I have to confess, and please forgive me for the brevity of my presentation, because it clearly does not do justice to the, to the 6 months of work and the 500-page document that we basically put together, which analyzed in deep detail why all of these things were happening, why there were gaps, and in our recommendations, therefore, we were presenting our headline messages in terms of how we could strengthen the readiness program of the GCF. So just to illustrate, in terms of what we were seeing in country, I think we have identified, when we looked at the implementation structure and the processes, we looked at both the absence of turnaround times, but we also looked at standard operating procedures. We commended the Secretariat that they had done a really good job in terms of thinking and rethinking a lot of the processes, but the key fault, for example, lay in not being able to communicate them in a timely way to regional advisors on the ground, which was also leading to, therefore, a chasm in communication between regional advisors and action on the ground. We then also looked at, for example, NDAs and their capacities, and this became especially salient if you look at the private sector and the big intention, very well-meaning and very strong intention of the Readiness program to work very closely with the private sector. But when we tried to diagnose it, we also found, and I think this was endorsed and confirmed also by the Secretariat, that there was a lack of capacity, both at the NDA level and a lack of guidance from the Secretariat as to how the GCF could reconcile to the very quick, sharp cycles that the private sector requires. And so I think we did an extremely detailed diagnosis of some of the challenges and the bottlenecks and the critical shortcomings in the overall implementation structure and the processes and the objectives. And I think hopefully what we are bringing to you is a constructive document, something that can be used by all of you to see as to how the GCF readiness program can go forward in a far more strong way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can't argue. I agree with most of your comments, taking into context that this is a new fund. The countries cannot identify an accredited entity without, first of all, knowing what the GCF is, what is the business model. They have to have an understanding of the GCF first, and the strengthening of the NDA is meant to do that through the consultative process so that all the stakeholders know what the GCF is all about. Now, where we failed in terms of process is that we should have had the country programs first. Once a country has a country program, then they look at what is in the country program, which are the most suitable entities at the country level to help the country implement the country program. Without that, what we are doing is just guessing. The entities are being identified without really knowing whether they fit within the overall strategy of the country. Of course, there were opportunities for countries to access the resources while this preparation is on. But we hope during the presentation of the revised country program, the readiness program, you would see how we want to provide a menu. Because countries are at different stages. Most of the countries that got initial readiness support through the other processes are the ones that are accessing more funds from the readiness than those that are just starting. But we agree with most of your comments, and most of them are taken into consideration in the revised readiness work program. Thank you.
So, Board, we have before us a very short decision on the evaluation, taking note of the findings and recommendations in the Secretariat management response, and also welcome Secretariat incorporating the management, the recommendation, and request Secretariat to update and report on this. Can I take it that the Board is ready to adopt this decision? Yes, Ali?
Thank you. Just a clarification, because there is a draft decision now in the report itself. So this is something else, and you are requesting for a new version of the decision. So it is it's a different decision. It is a different decision. Yeah. So could you please confirm that this is a different decision? Because it is on the page 48. It is, so 48. Could you please clarify? That's what we're discussing. Okay, just I want to clear on
Yeah, Ali, we have two decisions. Decision on 15A and one on 15B. We are considering 15A now. Okay? Okay.
That is included in the documentation.
The bit about the money is tomorrow.
The decision about money is tomorrow. and we already recognize some concern about that. Now we are adopting the decision on the evaluation. Can we take it that the board is ready to accept and adopt this decision? Thank you. Since there is already views expressed on the decision on 15B, I would encourage members who have concern about that one to contact the Secretariat and our team to try to address this before we consider this item tomorrow, if possible, of that. I would like now to give the floor to my co-chair,